This is a bright day for America.
All right!
I'm not voting for the Republican Party. I'm voting for the people of Alaska.
Who is being held accountable for doing nothing since 2013? Who? Where's my moral compass if I can't speak out just because I like someone? I think he should resign, and if he's unwilling to do that, then Congress should hold him accountable.
Thank you all. I'm Andrea Mitchell from NBC News and MSNBC, and it is so great to be back here. Thank you so much. And the women to my right need no introduction. You've seen them in the video, but Senator Lisa Murkowski, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We've got news unfolding around us, and this is the experience of the last 15 months. I think we're all bombarded. Syria. So far, at the moment when we walked out on stage, no military action. Reports that Secretary Mattis briefed the president yesterday at the National Security Council, and the Pentagon has been concerned that we should not be moving too precipitously, that the Syrians have already moved their equipment under, to Russian bases, and the concern is, how do you hit the Syrian regime without engaging in a wider war against Russia and Iran on the ground? It's basically what foreign policy experts would describe as a mess. So, what are the options? The president has been tweeting up a storm since Monday morning that he was going to go after them right away, and projecting a major strike, and now, so far, nothing. Senator Gillibrand, you're on armed services.
So I think the reason why Mattis has signaled that we need time is because there's no plan. There's literally no detailed plan. There's no exit strategy. There's no articulation of what the approach would be, what the strategy would be. And there also isn't an authorization for use of military force in Syria. The current authorization is based solely on 9/11 to go after al-Qaeda and affiliates. So there is no legitimate basis for the president to start a war in Syria. And so I think there's certainly going to be time for congressional oversight. I know that we're planning to have hearings next week, which I think are appropriate. But I really am not going to support what the president is signaling, because he has absolutely no plan and no strategy about what he intends to do.
And when Senator Gillibrand just referred to the fact that there's no authorization, a number of senators, Tim Kaine, Chris Coons, Senator Gillibrand, and others in both parties have been arguing there has been no authorization for war since immediately after 9/11, when the authorization was passed to go after al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Iraq. And all these years later, there is no authorization, but what does a president do when he sees another attack, chemical weapons? Hasn't he drawn a red line, just as President Obama did, frankly, in 2013, that the use of chemical weapons should demand a response?
Well, in fairness to the debate that should go on, must go on, with regards to an AUMF, the authorization of a military force, that needs to happen. We in Congress need to have that discussion. Where the president can help us with this is to stand down on the tweets, because that is not helping us with the seriousness of this.
Now, I interviewed Nikki Haley yesterday at Senate Foreign Relations. It was a hearing on Mike Pompeo to be the next Secretary of State. And some would argue we haven't had a Secretary of State for the last 15 months. But the State Department has been greatly diminished. But this really is an issue of real consternation, I think, for Republicans and Democrats, because some people think that the CIA director is not the right person for the job, based on some of the things he said, anti-Muslim things, homophobic things. But the other issue is we have not had leadership at the State Department, and the diplomats, frankly, are just crying for someone who will restore the budget cuts and maybe fill some of the vacancies. Senator Gillibrand, what do you do?
Well, I voted against Pompeo in the first instance, and I think he is not the right choice to be Secretary of State because of his record. He's a war hawk. He supported torture in the past. I don't think he can be the face of diplomacy effectively. So I have concerns about that nomination. And then you add to that Bolton as National Security Advisor, and you have, a hawk among hawks there. And so I just don't know how President Trump is going to be able to receive information about diplomatic and political solutions in all the turmoil we have around the world. And so I'm really concerned about his choices.
He was elected. Is he not entitled, the counter-argument would be, entitled to his own choice of cabinet in terms of the ideology?
I think he certainly is entitled to put his nominations forward. Our role then in the Senate is to provide for that confirmation or, in certain cases, deny that. But I think what is imperative, whether you would be a no vote or a yes vote, is that we move quickly. We need a Secretary of State. We have to have not only the secretary level filled, but we have other offices within the Department of State that are left vacant. We have ambassadors to key countries that have not yet been filled. So when you think about the role of diplomacy and the role that the Secretary of State plays, he or she is one person, but making sure that that is rounded out has got to be an imperative for us.
When I talk to people in the State Department, and as you just pointed out, we have 37 vacant ambassadorships. Mm-hmm. And this is not, in most cases, not because Chuck Schumer and the Democrats are holding up confirmations. These are people who have not been nominated. Right. And I think that the issue goes back to, first of all, the transition. When you have all of these departments empty and people not lined up, Chris Christie was fired, Mike Pence took over the transition. Despite what they say, from personal knowledge, they did not expect to win. They were briefing network and newspaper offices 2 days before the election, and they said they only had a 20% chance of winning. So they weren't really ready to fill those slots. Senator Murkowski.
That's fair. But we're also, 15, 16 months into the administration, and we have so many vacancies, whether it's ambassadorships, as you have pointed out, or in other areas. So I think there's plenty of room for blame in terms of why we have these vacancies. On the one hand, the administration needs to put these names forward. On the other hand, we've got an obligation, I think, to move them more quickly. And in fairness, this is where we've seen some of the stall out. We have procedural rules within the Senate that allow you to take things much longer, or you can gain unanimous consent to just proceed. And I think this is one of those areas where, again, I wish we could get back to that more collaborative nature of how the Senate is really fundamentally based, which is a consent-based approach to governing, different than the House. But when we decide that we're going to elongate the process, which is already long enough, you do have a vacancy in governance, and we see the results.
It's wonderful to be here with the
I do have a
you.
Solution to her problem.
Yeah, I would imagine what it is.
Elect more women.
There we go.
And that's a perfect segue. That is a perfect segue because there are 22 women senators. And from my own experience, the relationships among the women, Republican as well as Democratic, in terms of working together, in fact, there are data on this, that studies show that women in Congress get more done by working together than their male counterparts. Not to be sexist here, but it's true. You guys have been working together on a bunch of things, including sexual harassment and policing the Senate. How far has that gone?
So Lisa and I have been working together since I arrived in the Senate, and I just want to sing her praises on a couple of things. She's one of the reasons why we passed the 9/11 health bill, because when I was a brand new senator, I went to her and Susan Collins and Olympia Snow and said, how do I do this as a new senator? How do I get the Senate to care about our first responders who obviously raced up those towers when everybody else was coming down? And they were quite frank with me and said, well, this is how we imagine if you pay for it this way, we can get Republican votes. And they were helping me behind the scenes the whole time. So they've always made a difference. And Lisa particularly also was there for me when we were repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Also made a difference on pretty much most legislation I work on, whether it's sexual assault in the military or on college campuses or now in Congress. And just recently, we have these quarterly dinners, and a lot of us started to talk about how the congressional rules are broken, very arcane. It takes you 3 months to even file a complaint. If the member of Congress is the harasser, the taxpayer pays any settlement. And so it became really clear to us at that dinner.
Secret settlements, which are the equivalent of these non-disclosure
agreements. And then the survivor isn't allowed to talk about it. And so Lisa right away said, yes, I'd love to work on that. And we already have a bill that has over 30 co-sponsors, bipartisan, to change the rules, make it really simple, make sure that taxpayers don't pay if the member is responsible, and to have a streamlined process where the survivor controls whether she wants to be public or not.
But in fairness, this is, as Kirsten has outlined, this is something that in the Congress, when we found out, we were sitting at a dinner at the Library of Congress, the women were sitting there, and I had just found out what our rules were, because it's all in the news, and well, how do we handle it in the Congress? And when I found out that there's a cooling off period for the victim. You have to think about it. You have to think about it for 30 days before you can file, and then you have to go into mandatory mediation.
Guys. A cooling off period so
for
that
the victim.
And evidence and witness testimony and all evaporates.
Crazy. And so at that dinner, we said, it is almost an embarrassment that in the United States Congress, we would have such arcane, really so backward-looking rules as they apply to us. Here we are working on other initiatives out in the workplace to provide for greater protection, and we have, in my view, one of the worst policies. Yeah. So you would think that we would be able to just make it happen like that. The fact that we are still working on this, I think, is unfortunate, but we are told that it is moving again in a cooperative bipartisan effort. But I think part of that was led because all of the women in the Senate came together and signed a letter to our respective leaderships saying this needs to be an imperative. It's now moving forward, and we're going to keep pushing to make sure that it actually gets done.
You know, I was covering the Senate. in 1991 during the Clarence Thomas hearings when Pat Schroeder and Louise Slaughter, late, recently departed, wonderful member of Congress, these House Democratic women, I think they were mostly Democrats. I can't think of a Republican in this bunch because of that particular caucus. They marched, and it had never happened before. They marched from the House to the Senate and barged into the Senate lunches, the caucus lunch that day. It was a Tuesday, and the Senate policy lunches were taking place, demanding more time before the Judiciary Committee reported out and permitted a vote on Clarence Thomas. So that was the beginning of action. But now it's really evolved. You've both referred to these dinners. You, as a caucus, a bipartisan caucus, meet several times a year.
Yes.
We don't call ourselves a caucus, though. It's just the women's dinner, the women getting together. Because it's not, a caucus has a business purpose.
Okay.
This is about how you build relationships. Because when I know that Theo is looking to go to this school and Henry is having problems on the playground.
Theo and Henry are Kirsten's
sons.
darling
boys. And she knows that my boys are now off and about and looking at serious relationships. We've got other things that we can talk about and relate to, just like everybody in your workforce. But how you make connections and how you take the time to do that. We are really busy. We are really busy people in the Senate. And when you fail to take time to find out who one another really are, what you like as a person, how you can help, what your interests are, it makes it difficult to connect on the hard policy things because we have a lot of hard things in front of us.
So I know that Lisa Murkowski makes a really good berry cobbler because when my family went to Alaska, she hosted a dinner party at her house, and her husband taught my sons how to fish salmon in the Kenai.
Yeah.
There you go.
And actually, I can share something. I spent a lot of time in Alaska when I was covering a former governor who was running for vice president. Another whole issue. Even went salmon fishing in waders. But Kirsten Gillibrand is a hell of a softball pitcher. She is the captain of our young women's team, the Young Survival Coalition for Breast Cancer. And she has... to someone, I'm a survivor, and she, not young, but a survivor. And she has been one of the leaders of the press get-together, and we have a team against the Senate House team.
Yeah, we practiced this morning. I've recruited Joni Ernst from the Senate. She's really good. She played in high school. Amazing arm.
Republican
from Iowa. So we have a huge opportunity to win this year. We rarely do win. We are at least 20, 30, maybe 40 years older than the press team. But we try hard, and it's fun. So
You still haven't been able to get me because I can't do your early morning practices. I'm like, no, I'm on Alaska time.
She's still on Alaska time, so she can't do the 7 a.m. But Joni's up at 5 a.m. rucking 40 miles anyway, so she's fine.
Well, she's a former National Guardswoman.
Yeah, yes.
And the first woman elected statewide from Iowa by either party, but a Republican.
So we keep it bipartisan.
You were elected in a write-in vote. Now, that wasn't the first time, because once you were elected, you fought the party and voted against the president on health care. The write-in vote, though, you went up against the establishment. I can't remember another time, you would probably know the history better than I, where a woman, whether anyone is elected in a write-in vote statewide.
In 1954, Strom Thurmond, there was a complication with the ballot. He ended up not being on, and so there was actually a write-in back in 1954 with Strom Thurmond. So when I was defeated in 2010 by a Tea Party candidate and was prepared to accept the results, I was asked by a lot of Alaskans, saying, just allow us to write your name in because we're going to do it anyway. My problem was my last name is 9 letters long. And so not only did we have to teach people how to spell Murkowski, we had to do the mechanics of you have to fill in that little bubble, you have to write it in correctly, and do so in about a 5-week period. It was a very important exercise, I think, for the Alaskan electorate to be involved in something where it was a proactive endorsement of a candidate. When you go in and you say, well, you're better than that person, or lesser of two evils, to be proactive in this way allows you to realize that the base that we all look to can be very, very, very different when you are appealing across party lines, because there are no lines in a write-in other than what people have chosen to put down your name.
So Lisa wears this bracelet, and it's a replica of what she gave to her voters. She gave them all bracelets that said Lisa Murkowski, so they would know how to spell her name when they went into the voting booth.
It says, fill it in, write it in, and spells Lisa Murkowski.
It's right, brilliant.
In case I get lost, I know who my name is.
And we're at a time now in Washington, I've never seen anything like it, where the Secretary of State gets fired at 8:44 in the morning on Twitter, and there is reporting today by NBC News, and I know you heard from Sally Yates earlier, but there's reporting today that Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, is telling colleagues he expects to be fired imminently and is prepared for that. So we are about to go through, most likely, another potential constitutional crisis, because the dominoes of that will lead potentially to either changing, sidelining, or damaging the Mueller investigation. What can or should the Senate do?
Well, we have a bipartisan bill right now to prevent that from happening, that in fact, the only way Mueller can be fired is for cause. And so we have a bill to say we want to take that to a judge, and the judge can actually make the determination about whether cause exists. And in the meantime, that all staff are preserved, all evidence is preserved, nothing can be destroyed, but it's all on hold. And so that is a bipartisan bill that I'm hopeful we can actually get a vote on sometime in the next week or so, because a lot of us are very worried. I think it does create a constitutional crisis. And I think it is obstruction of justice in a prima facie case, and I think it's really problematic for the country. And so I hope that we can come together as a body, at least move forward this piece of legislation to make sure that things aren't done inappropriately. And I think if you did fire Rosenstein, the purpose would be to then have someone in place who will fire Mueller. So it worries me, and I think we have to try to prevent that from happening.
Do you support that legislation, or could you, depending on how it evolves?
Depending on what this actually, the legislation that Kirsten has just described, I think most would say is reasonable. What I have stated to others is it's unfortunate that we're even having to have this discussion, that we're even having to think about legislation that would put the brakes on something like this. I think it is so important, it is so imperative that this investigation be allowed to go forward, and it will take the course that it will take. And so any action that would either throw a roadblock in or completely derail it, that I think takes us to another level where, again, you can, whether you call it a constitutional crisis, there is so much that is at play right now. You started off the questioning, Andrea, talking about Syria. We have North Korea. We have the opioid crisis that we're dealing with domestically. We have so many issues. And for the Congress, for the executive to be just so focused on these distractive, horribly, unnecessarily distractive issues. Let this investigation move forward and come to its logical conclusion, but the president should not be intervening with a firing of Mueller.
Do you think that the Senate leadership will let this legislation get to the floor if necessary? Because so far, what Mitch McConnell has said, I believe, the latest thing that he said last I checked was, we're not going to need legislation. He's not going to do that. And Lindsey Graham had said that would be the end of his presidency. But does he do an end run by firing Rosenstein, and that sort of leaves Mueller vulnerable to whoever comes in?
I think the fact that you've got a bipartisan bill, and I don't know how many have actually joined on to that bill at this point in time, but the fact that the Chairman Grassley, has said we're going to have a hearing on this, the fact that you've got two bills now that have been merged together with, again, equal numbers on both sides, that's somewhat telling about whether or not there's going to be support moving forward. So,
Senator Gillibrand?
I am hopeful that we can at least do something, because this is outrageous and it's making people anxious. I mean, the reality of this presidency for me, Andrea, is that since the election, I mean, you've seen just the number of people around my state feel anxious, feel worried about the future. And this president's really taken on institutions, whether he's taking on the free press, whether he's taking on the independence of the judiciary, the independence of the Department of Justice, or the notion of religious freedom with his Muslim ban, or his attack on DACA kids and the notion that we're a country founded by immigrants. It's making New Yorkers very uncertain about the future. And the one bright light that I've seen is the fact that the grassroots are rising, the fact that people want to participate in this democracy. You saw it with the Women's March, both marches this year and last year. You saw it with the Kids March to end gun violence. So, and you see it with a number of people running for office in the special elections, in the last elections, in this next 2018 election. You see women running. We have more women running than in the history of this country. Over 400 women alone are running for Congress. And so things are changing. And I think these are the kinds of issues that we all need to speak out to prevent from happening, because they are dangerous and they do undermine the sanctity of our separation of powers, our democracy, our norms. And so we have to fight back on the issues that we care most about. And I do think this independence of the Department of Justice is really important. And I think it is something that we all share. And so it's something worth fighting very hard for. And I certainly hope the Senate does their job.
You referenced the Kids March. It was so emotionally uplifting after such horrific events, after the tragedy, to see these young people taking charge of their lives and of their grief, and speaking the way they did, and the fact that they didn't permit anyone older than 18 to speak at that rally. And just watching that rally, I found enormously uplifting. Can they sustain this with political action?
I think so. I think most of the great movements of our country have been student-led. If you look at the civil rights movement, there was a lot of students participating in that. You look at the Vietnam movement. I think students are really important to the future of this country, and the fact that they feel so passionately, and the fact that they brought all groups together, that it's not about white privileged kids from the suburbs, it's about African American kids living in inner cities, it's about the entire community. And not only are the kids collaborating together, they are bringing different groups together to speak out in one voice about common sense things that most people support. I mean, Lisa and I she supported my gun trafficking bill because it was important to make sure criminals don't have access to weapons, which is all that gun trafficking does. It's something that would help our state and a lot of gun crime in our state. So I think there's a lot of common ground, and I hope that we can have a national debate about common sense things to vote on and hopefully make real change.
I think that what you're seeing with these young people, these kids, high schoolers, it is a momentum from them that I think, as you have pointed out, kind of helped with the healing, but also as an outlet for their expression. But I think it has been a significant wake-up to those of us in the Congress. When you have a 16-year-old say, I'm afraid, but I'm the kid, and you're the adult, and you're the lawmaker adult, and we expect some action. I think that if that doesn't motivate us to act, to come together for the good of these young people, but really the good of the country, maybe we really need to self-examine what we're doing there. This is important. This is important.
Senator Gillibrand, you have been, before sexual harassment and the Me Too movement and all, you were passionately fighting to police the military rape, male victims as well as female victims, but mostly female. What progress can we even look forward to?
So this is an issue that really came to my attention several years ago when I saw the film The Invisible War. And when you see that film, you are immediately convicted, because these are brave men and women who will sacrifice everything, including their lives, for this country, being brutally raped, then not only disbelieved, but then retaliated against for reporting. And what we found as we've investigated this issue, that it's not getting better. I mean, last year alone, there were over 15,000 instances of unwanted sexual contact, rape, and assault. And about 6,000 reported, about 4,000 openly, 2,000 confidentially. But most disturbingly, among those who reported, 59% reported that they were retaliated against for reporting. And so we need transparency, and one of the things Lisa and I and a lot of the women of the Senate work on is trying to allow the decision about whether a crime's been committed to be made by a trained military prosecutor, not a commander who unfortunately is not a lawyer, does not have criminal training, and often has biases that change their ability to make the right decision. And as a consequence, you have such a low rate of conviction and this high rate of retaliation. So we've moved the bill every year. We've only gotten a vote twice in the last 5 years. We didn't get a vote this year. We didn't get a vote last year. But every time we voted, we have more than half the Senate every single time supporting this reform. So I have not given up hope, and we will get more votes on it, and eventually we will pass this reform.
It's the right thing.
And we've just,
The right thing.
and I didn't mean to interrupt you. Lisa Murkowski was just saying it's the right thing, and that is all the time we have. But I just want to say, in 2001, when I was covering Hillary Clinton coming into the Senate, and I was up on the Hill, Barbara Mikulski had a book, 13 is Not Enough, 13 women senators. Now it's 22, and I think after watching the two of them, we would all agree 22 is not enough.
Not enough.
No,
So
not enough.
thank you all so very much.
Thank you.